So as you guys can see here, we're going to be talking about a lot of different organs. Some of these we've talked about before, like the pancreas, the pharynx we just talked about a little bit with the respiratory system is our throat, and there's a shared tube between our respiratory and our digestive systems. A lot of these things are going to be pretty much brand new to us. And we haven't really talked much about the stomach or the intestines, the liver, we talked a little bit about, but not too much. And, esophagus is something that's brand new to us, as are structures associated with our mouth, and that includes your salivary glands. So what we're going to do is learn a little bit about digestion, and then we're kind of going to go down the path of our tract. Speaking of our tract, that is one of the two groups of organs that make up our digestive system. The tract, or GI, gastrointestinal tract, also known as alimentary canal, is a continuous tube extending from our mouth to the anus through both the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. This includes our mouth, most of our pharynx, the esophagus, our stomach, small intestine, and large intestine. Collectively is about 5 to 7 meters in length, or 16.5 to 23 feet in a living person, which, as you guys know, none of us are 16.5 to 23 feet tall, indicating that there's going to be a lot of twisting and turning and folding going on, especially in our small intestine, which doesn't get its name for its length, but instead for its width. Okay. It actually grows in length after we die because of loss of muscle contraction. Okay. The tension in our muscles that line our tract goes away, and therefore it basically becomes longer. Not that that's really important. For us, but it's kind of cool information. We'll also talk about some accessory digestive organs. Your mouth has your teeth and your tongue, help with chewing and swallowing. Your salivary glands that are associated with your oral cavity that do different things. We'll talk about those, producing saliva. And then you've got your liver, gallbladder, and pancreas, which produce chemicals that aid digestion, and we'll talk about those. Okay. One of the first things the book talks about in this chapter are the 6 different functions of the digestive system. And it's a lot more complicated than just eating. Okay, and by eating, most people just think of chewing up your food and swallowing it. And that's actually the first function, ingestion. Okay. Then you've got secretion, listed second, actually aids ingestion, but it also aids a lot of different things as well. Secretion is where cells within the walls of our GI tract, or our accessory digestive organs, secrete chemicals and fluids that are dumped into the lumen of the tract. Each day, about 7 liters of chemicals are dumped into our tract. Okay, so I always use the 2-liter pop bottle as a kind of example. I'm talking about 3.5 of those. Okay. So that's a lot of fluid. Okay. In those fluids, you'll have water, acid, buffers, and enzymes doing different things. Okay. And it begins in our mouth with the secretion of saliva. Okay. Step 3 here, function 3, is mixing and propulsion. We have alternating contractions and relaxation of the smooth muscles in the walls of our GI tract to mix food and secretions, as well as to propel food toward our anus. So it helps mix things up. That helps with the 4th function there, digestion. Now our capacity of the GI tract to mix and move material along its length is called motility. Digestion, obviously, is one of the functions of the digestive system, is where we break down food molecules into smaller parts, okay, i.e. proteins into amino acids. This begins in our mouth with physical digestion or mechanical digestion, a process where we cut food pieces into smaller pieces. Okay? So think of like cartoons when a person eats a cheeseburger and they swallow the whole cheeseburger. That's not what we do. Okay? Hopefully, anyway, none of you guys are doing that. We're chewing up our food into smaller pieces. That makes it easier for chemical digestion to occur. Okay? Chemical digestion is where we use chemical reactions to break things down. Okay? Hydrolysis reactions specifically, where we break covalent bonds of proteins to form the amino acids. So you have to think all the way back to the beginning of the semester when we talked about the 4 organic compounds: carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. We learned that, for example, carbs were made up of monosaccharides, proteins were made up of amino acids, nucleic acids are made up of nucleotides, and fats are made up of various things. But we can't directly absorb and bring into our body those more complex structures. So like amino acids are what we can absorb, so our body must break those proteins down into the amino acids. Okay. The whole purpose of eating is to provide our body with the nutrients and the fuel it needs. Now, for that to occur, we must bring those substances into our blood or lymph, and that's what absorption is. The entrance of ingested and secreted fluids, ions, and the products of digestion into epithelial cells that line the GI tract. Those absorbed substances either then make their way into the bloodstream or into our lymph, where they then can circulate to the cells throughout the body. Only molecules that are absorbed enter the body. Wastes remain in the intestinal lumen and are considered outside of the body. So for those of you who had breakfast this morning or are sipping on some drink right now, that food that's sitting in your stomach or intestines is not actually part of you yet. It's still technically outside your body. Even though it's inside of us, like literally, it's not doing us really any good where it's at in that state until it's brought into our bloodstream or lymph. Okay? Soaked into your body that way. What's left over includes waste, indigestible substances, bacteria, and cells sloughed off the inner lining of our tract, or any digestive materials not absorbed will leave the body through our anus, which we call feces, and we know that is basically a fancy way to describe the act of pooping. Now, before we get into each of the structures of the tract, which is what we're going to do here, I do want to talk about the layers of the tract. It's important. We'll see a figure here on the next page. Our GI tract, all the way from our lower esophagus, which is down by our stomach, to our anal canal, has the same basic 4-layered arrangement of tissues. There's an inner mucosa, a second layer surrounding it called the submucosa, a third layer surrounding it, known as a muscularis, and then on the outside is a serosa. And those are all labeled down here at the bottom of our page, where we can see this is the small intestine, but that is the mucosa. This is a very important layer. This is our inner lining of the tract. It is a mucous membrane composed of 3 thin layers. We have exocrine cells found throughout this layer that secrete mucus and fluid into the lumen of the tract. We also have endocrine cells that secrete hormones into our bloodstream that aid in various digestive functions. So yes, we will be talking about more hormones in this lecture. So we just can't get away from those, just like we can't get away with sympathetic and parasympathetic, as you'll see on the next slide. There are also many blood and lymphatic vessels found in the mucosa, the routes by which nutrients are absorbed in our tract. So you can see down here at the bottom, mucosa includes the epi, a lamina propria, and a muscularis mucosa. There's mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. We talked about that with the Peyer's patches. There's also glands, but you can't really see that there are a lot of blood vessels. Okay. There's also a lot of blood vessels and glands in our second layer, the submucosa. Okay. This binds the mucosa to the third layer, the muscularis. Okay. A very important aspect of the submucosa is an extensive network of neurons known as the submucosal plexus. Okay. There is the third layer known as the muscularis. You can guess why they call it that. This is where you find that smooth muscle, okay, that aids in that motility aspect of things that we were just talking about. Okay. Some of our tract contains 3 layers of smooth muscle. Some of it only contains 2. Okay. Not that that's super important in here, but that's kind of cool to know. There's a second plexus of neurons here, known as the myenteric plexus. Okay. Do you guys remember what my or myo meant? This is the neurons that controls the smooth muscle. Okay. And then on the outside is the serosa, which really isn't that important to us physiologically. It's basically what holds the tract in place. Okay. Now let's talk more about that enteric plexus. Okay. Those 2 enteric plexuses, excuse me. Our enteric nervous system, as we learned previously, is a division of the nervous system aiding in digestion. Neurons of the enteric nervous system include the myenteric plexus, or sometimes you'll see it's listed as the plexus of Auerbach. Okay, that's these neurons located within the muscularis, and that's what controls GI tract motility. So it controls the contraction of our tract. Okay. The submucosal plexus, or plexus of Meissner, as it's sometimes known as, is what controls the secretion of organs of our tract. Okay. So it activates the release of glands to help digest. Okay. Now, these plexes consist of motor neurons, interneurons, and sensory neurons. Okay. We can actually see that over here. We've got in blue sensory neurons. Here's the purple interneurons, and in red are the motor neurons. Okay. The sensory neurons either function as chemoreceptors or as stretch receptors. Okay. Excuse me. The chemoreceptors are going to respond to certain chemicals in our food present in the lumen. Okay. For example, when food hits your stomach after we've swallowed, the pH in your stomach is going to change. Okay. And that will activate these chemoreceptors. Also, when food hits your stomach, it's going to start to stretch the stomach out. Or when it hits your intestines, it's going to stretch the intestines. Those stretch-sensitive mechanoreceptors will activate different things. Okay? So we can see that here. Okay? They send the signals in, whether it's a change in chemical concentration or a change in stretch. They send the signal not only to the submucosal plexus, but the myenteric plexus. Both of those are connected by interneurons. Okay? And then the motor neurons are the ones that send the signal out and either tell the submucosal, or from the submucosal plexus, tell the glands to start release, or the muscles to start contracting. And therefore controlling GI motility and secretion. Although the neurons of the enteric nervous system can function independently, they are subject to regulation by neurons of the autonomic nervous system. And we know the parasympathetic nervous system, which we described, produces that rest and digest response. Obviously, is going to increase the activity of these by stimulating the enteric nervous system, whereas that fight or flight response produced by the sympathetic nervous system is going to decrease secretions and activity of the enteric nervous system, or by the enteric nervous system. And if you ever wonder why, if you try to go for a run right after you've eaten a meal, your stomach starts to hurt, because you are inhibiting those organs, because you're inhibiting the neurons that supply it. A little bit more here on the enteric nervous system. Many neurons of the enteric nervous system are components of GI reflex pathways, regulating GI secretion and motility in response to stimuli present in the lumen of the tract. Initial components of a typical GI reflex pathway are sensory receptors, like those chemoreceptors and mechanoreceptors we just talked about, associated with sensory neurons of the enteric nervous system. Axons of these sensory neurons can synapse with other neurons located in the ENS, the CNS, or the ANS, informing these regions about the nature of the contents and the degree of extension or stretching of the tract. Neurons of the enteric, the central, and the autonomic nervous systems subsequently activate or inhibit GI glands and smooth muscle, altering GI secretion and motility. If this reflex pathway is confined entirely within the GI tract wall, it's called a short reflex. If it's going to involve not only the GI tract but also the central nervous system and autonomic nerves, we refer to it as a long reflex. And you can imagine why. All right, now we can get into the actual organs. And so we'll start with not necessarily just an organ, but a place where you find several organs, and that is your mouth, also known as your oral or buccal cavity, formed by our cheeks, the hard palates, the hard and soft palates, and our tongue. Now, we have salivary glands located in and around our oral cavity that secrete saliva, or as we like to call it a lot of times, just spit. Ordinarily, we secrete just enough saliva to keep our mouth and pharynx moist and clean. But as we start to smell food, see food, or put food in our mouth, we're going to start pumping out more of it. Okay. Structurally or chemically, saliva is only about 0.5% other stuff, 99.5% water. Among those dissolved substances, you have sodium, potassium, bicarbonate, chloride, phosphate, dissolved gases, various organic substances like urea and uric acid, mucus, which is very helpful because that helps the food slide down our esophagus, and then immunoglobulin A, that antibody we learned about previously, lysozyme, which is that antibacterial chemical that we learned about previously, and then salivary amylase. Anytime a word ends in ace, do you guys remember what we're typically going to know that as, or what it is? It's an enzyme. And enzymes are very, very important because they aid in that chemical digestion. Secretion of saliva is called salivation, controlled via parasympathetic nervous system. 3 pairs of salivary glands are found. Really, it should not say in the oral cavity, but dump into the oral cavity because they're located kind of outside of it, but they have ducts that connect to it. We have a pair of parotid glands. These are located kind of right here in your cheeks, underlying your masseter muscle in front of and below the external ear. Produce a water or serous type of saliva that contains salivary amylase. Talk more about salivary amylase here in just a second. Submandibular glands located just below the mandibular angle produce both amylases and mucus. And then sublingual glands located in front of the submandibular glands produce mucus to aid in the sliding. So some of them produce mucus only, some of them produce enzymes only, some of them, as you see the submandibulars, produce mucus and enzymes. The tongue contains lingual glands secreting both mucus and a watery serous fluid containing the enzyme lingual lipase. Another enzyme, but digests something else. Okay. Our mouth performs both mechanical and chemical digestion. Mechanical digestion in the mouth involves that chewing. Okay. The act of chewing is known as mastication. Okay. To masticate. It is going to occur, and our tongue aids that, mixes our food up with the saliva to form what's called a bolus. The bolus is a fancy word to describe the mass of food and saliva that we swallow. Okay. Chemical digestion also occurs in the mouth, which involves those enzymes I was just talking about. Salivary amylase, secreted by our salivary glands, acts on starches. Now, what are starches? Are they fats? Are they carbs? Are they proteins? Or are they nucleic acids? They're carbs. So I'm going to do something, and I'm going to continue doing this throughout this entire lecture, so I'm going to have to rewrite it up because I'm not going to get all the way through the lecture today. We're going to keep a tally on enzymes and chemicals that help us digest carbs, that aid us in digesting fats, and then aid in digesting proteins. So we have an enzyme that helps us digest carbs. here in our mouth called salivary amylase. Okay. It helps us break down those polysaccharides, which hopefully are the primary component of our diet, or primary carb form in our diet. Okay. We can't absorb polysaccharides, but we can absorb monosaccharides. To get from polys to monos, we have various enzymes, and that begins in our mouth. Now, salivary amylase really likes a higher pH than a lower pH. Our mouth has a pretty high pH compared to our stomach, because in our stomach we release acid, which is going to lower your pH. Now, enzymes, as we know, are a form of protein. And proteins, if you remember, think of like my slinky analogy, can become unwound and unfunctionable, or don't function anymore. Unfunctionable is not a word. They stop functioning when they unwind, just like a slinky stops functioning when it unwinds. Remember that word, denature? Okay. So salivary amylase will work in your mouth and for a while in your stomach until the low pH of the stomach denatures it and stops it from functioning. The opposite works for lingual lipase. What do you think lingual lipase helps to digest? Lingual lipase. What's the other name for fats? Lipids. Lingual lipase doesn't actually start working until it hits the stomach. And then it becomes activated by that acidic environment. Does that make sense? Okay, so those are our first two enzymes. From our mouth, food then travels into our pharynx, which is a funnel-shaped tube extending from our internal nares, which is not important to us for digestive purposes, because we're not swallowing food through our nose. But it extends from those internal nares to our esophagus posteriorly and to the larynx anteriorly. It is made up of skeletal muscle and is divided into three parts. The nasopharynx, which is only important for respiratory purposes, because we breathe through our nose, we don't eat through our nose. Our oropharynx, which is behind our mouth, is important for digestive, but also respiratory purposes. And then your laryngopharynx, which also functions for both digestive and respiratory functions. What we don't want, though, is food going into your larynx, okay, because that's your structure that then leads to your windpipe. We want it to pass posteriorly to your esophagus. Okay. Now, to help this occur, muscular contractions will help propel the food into your esophagus. The esophagus is a collapsible muscular tube, about 25 centimeters or 10 inches long, lying posterior to our trachea. It secretes mucus and transports food into our stomach. Does not produce any enzymes or perform any absorption. So all you can think of your esophagus is just a conduit, meaning it connects your mouth to your stomach. It doesn't do anything else other than carry the food to our stomach. Okay. Now, it contains those four layers: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. Okay, you can see I listed the mucosa, important in our esophagus because it provides protection against wear and tear. Muscularis is very important, and we actually divide it into thirds. The thirds, superior third, is made up of skeletal muscle. We know skeletal muscle is under what type of control? Voluntary, right? And that's important because that's going to be a way that we can voluntarily control our swallowing. Okay. The middle third is made up of both skeletal and smooth, and then the inferior third is completely smooth, which we know smooth is completely involuntarily controlled. Okay. There are two sphincters, upper and lower, that regulate movement of food into the esophagus and then out of the esophagus into the stomach. Okay. Swallowed food is pushed through our esophagus by a wave-like contraction called peristalsis. Peristalsis can be talked about and seen more here on this page. As mentioned earlier, GI motility occurs because of contraction in the wall of the GI tract. Okay. Two major patterns of GI motility include peristalsis and segmentation. We'll talk more about segmentation in the future organs. Okay. Your esophagus is where we begin this process of peristalsis. It's a progression of coordinated contractions and relaxations of both circular and longitudinal layers of the muscularis. We describe it as a progressive motility producing forward movement of matter along the tract. Okay. And it's done because contractions occur behind the ball of food. That pushes it forward. Okay. I always like to talk about squeezing toothpaste out of a toothpaste tube. There's two ways to do it. Okay, the way that I do it, which is the correct way, and the way that my wife does it, which is the incorrect way. Okay. Someday when you guys get married, you might have this argument. We have it all the time.
How would you tell her that first?
I do. That's okay. I like to grab the toothpaste by the end of the tube and always squeeze it forward, which is the correct way. Okay, that is peristalsis. And my lovely wife will come in and grab the toothpaste and take away all the fancy work I did and grab it in the middle and squeeze the toothpaste out, but also backwards. She's performing segmentation, okay, where you're not only producing forward movement, but it's also backwards movement. Okay. Segmentation is a mixing movement involving digestive reflexes that produce that forward and backward movement with a single segment of the GI tract. Okay. This is an example of mechanical digestion. Okay. So this helps chop up food into smaller pieces, like chopping up the toothpaste into a glob on one side and a glob on the other side. This does not take place in our esophagus, but we will see segmentation in some of our future organs. Now, for food to get to our stomach, we have to swallow it. The act of swallowing is fancily known as deglutition. Facilitated by secretions of saliva and mucus. It involves not just our mouth, not just our pharynx, but also the esophagus that we just talked about. When we think of swallowing, generally what we think of is just the oral phase. This is the voluntary stage where we push the food bolus into our oral pharynx. The second phase is the pharyngeal phase, involuntarily passing the food bolus from our pharynx into our esophagus. Now, when that bolus enters our oropharynx, it sends impulses, or it doesn't, but the receptors in there send impulses to our deglutition center in our medulla oblongata and lower pons. The returning impulses will cause a soft palate uvula to move upward, closing off the nasopharynx. Okay, so it prevents food from going up into our nose. Okay. Epiglottis, which is the covering of our respiratory tract, also blocks off that respiratory tract to allow the bolus to slide instead of into our breathing tubes into our esophagus. Okay, and then step 3 or stage 3 is the esophageal phase. That involves that peristalsis, pushing the bolus forward and through that lower esophageal sphincter into our stomach. Mucus secreted by our esophageal glands lubricates the bolus, reduces friction. Passage of solid or semi-solid food from our mouth to the stomach takes 4 to 8 seconds. Very soft foods and liquids pass through in about a second. Peristaltic contractions are so strong in the esophagus that you could do a handstand after swallowing food and the food would still reach your stomach. So don't think of it like the force of gravity doing the work, although I'm sure that helps a lot because you can stand on your head and swallow and get the food into your stomach still. Not that that would be a recommended thing. But. All right, we will pick up with the stomach on Wednesday.